In the aftermath of the war against the Seleucids, Scythia roiled in its isolated, wild northern home, and Rathnacuda lorded over it, unopposed but unhappy. His Hadavgoda, his god room, was woefully incomplete, and his sense of ownership was anything but total. He was mad, yes, but he wasn't a savage, and he did have a mind for conquest. As such, for the next 10 years, he would slowly expand, settling the unsettled lands, all the while harshly drilling the men loyal to him, turning his armies into an unstoppable, near-perfect mechanism of conquest, a collective avatar of war. Alongside this, he also engaged in a rare act of distant diplomacy with Egypt, sending them steppe horses for their famed chariots and inculcating an informal working relationship between the two distant powers in the hopes to embolden Egypt against the Seleucids. In 218, Lucania, under Rex Titus Caecilius, struck the final blow against the Etruscans and their short-lived empire of Tuscia. In 215, with Rathnacuda in his 60s and his armies bolstered, he backed the coup attempt of a desperate aristocrat in the regionally significant walled trading city of Byzantion, named Zitzis Porid. With his backing, against all odds, Zitzis became Archon of Byzantion, and Scythia had gained a new ally, loyal to the end. On the 18th of September, 215, Scythia launched a new conflict, the Fourth Greco-Scythian War, marching on the remains of the Bosporan Kingdom with all his loyal men for the final conquest of their kingdom, as well as claims on the worship of Poseidon, with the addition of Apollo for his vague association with horses due to the steeds that propel his chariot across the sky. Of course, Scythia brought Armenia and Byzantion into the fray, and the Seleucid Empire responded in kind, declaring war in support for the Bosporans and bringing their ally Macedon with them. In much the same vein as last time, Egypt declared war upon Macedon for further conquest against them, bringing their allies of Rhodes and Lycia with them, which put them in direct conflict with the Seleucids, the defenders of the Hellenic world. The reworked Scythian army, complete with heavy cavalry and light skirmishers and ranged divisions, washed over the Bosporans in a single month, putting their cities to the torch and carrying off their statues to Poseidon and Apollo. This was decided with the last stand of the Bosporan Greeks at the siege of Zabender, where the city used everything in its power to fend off the Scythians, including massive infantry charges of heavily armored phalanxes, so weighed down by their armor that they could do scarcely more than thrust their spears, and when the Scythians used siege towers to breach their walls anyway, the Bosporans released wild bears into their own city in order to slaughter as many Scythians as possible and attempt to retreat. This was a deadly affair, but the Bosporan retreat failed, and the last Spartacid, Basileus Poloniotos, was fed to bears, ending his bloodline. Now, with a direct channel to Seleucid territory, this is where the real war began. The mountainous territory was ill-suited to Rathnacuda's preferred cavalry maneuvers, but it was totally prohibitive to the Seleucids' famed war elephants, allowing the Scythian momentum to be somewhat maintained through the grinding mountain combat. With the help of the Armenians, the Scythians were able to spill out of the Caucasus into the Seleucid heartland, engaging in raiding and building up resources for major sieges, like the target they had on the city of Gazaka on the shore of Lake Matianus. Gazaka was a major regional hub, protected by nearly 20,000 men, essentially linking the western territories to the rest of the Seleucid realm. Without it, the west would likely fall. As such, Rathnacuda slowly made his way south, leaving a trail of blood and bone in his wake. Meanwhile, the Armenians largely focused on occupying their own former territory, with the hopes of reclaiming it, while the Egyptians contested Mesopotamia. By 213, however, Egypt suffered a revolt at the hands of a native Egyptian commander, a man named Shamar Bostara. His revolt was quickly put down, with him being personally drowned in the Nile, but his revolt had set a precedent of ethnic minority resentment in the form of Egyptian nationalism against their Greek overlords. In fact, he was elevated to godhood, referred to by his surname, worshipped by the common folk. The Greek pharaohs outlawed Bostara worship, and made such a crime punishable by death. This cult would prove to be a problem for years to come. Back to the war engulfing the region, many decisive battles took place between 212 and 210. There was the Battle of Valent in Seleucid territory, contesting a fortress complex that controlled the traversable coastal strip along the Caspian Sea that was the only real passage south, given a portion of Caucasus Mountains pinned all passerby to the coast. The Scythians and their open field advantages were almost totally nullified in this context, forced to fight on foot and pull their steeds behind. The battle quickly became a siege, with Scythian men in tight, regimented formation continually assaulting Valent in shifts, using slings and arrows to pick off defenders from atop the walls. However, this alone would not break the defenses, were it not for the Armenian army, which came around behind Valent, breaking through on the other side, having cracked open Derbent for their own purposes. As such, Valent quickly fell, and now Scythia had unrestricted access to the rest of Seleucid territory. There was also the Isfahan encampment, where Armenian and Scythian forces corralled and encircled a major Seleucid force in a minor mountain region. Their general, Xenocrates, did not despair, and instead skittered about the mountains, only engaging with the enemy forces as they came, avoiding any and all direct, major combat with a numerically superior enemy. Supply lines were totally cut off, so there was no going home, and there was certainly no chance of an outright victory, at least not until the war's end. Such was the nature of the Isfahan encampment, a game of cat and mouse that went on for the entirety of the war, continual combat that would simply go unresolved. In a way, this was the closest thing to victory that Xenocrates could get his hands on, and indeed, it was exactly what he wanted. Another major altercation was the Arcisa push, where the Seleucid army would rush forward into Armenian territory as fast as possible, with separate flanking divisions designed to prevent encirclement. This rapid warfare necessitated at least one 48-hour march, and caught the Armenians totally off guard, giving them nearly no time to respond. By the time they did, much of the east was under Seleucid control, and they had entrenched themselves. Further west, another major battle was the Corinthian Crush. Egypt capitalized immediately on its Greek holdings to attempt a push further north into Macedon, and came to the city of Corinth, which lay in the center of a long, thin strip of land that leads into the more contiguous northern regions of the Greek peninsula. The Macedonians put up a legendary defense, even sending mad bulls through the gates to trample Egyptian troops, and rerouting seawater inland in order to make the ground muddy and nigh impossible to traverse, especially for heavy siege equipment. However, this was not enough, as the Egyptian navy was able to pull up on either side of the city and bombard it, with some even letting off men behind the city to assault it from both sides, ultimately leading to an Egyptian victory, and the front line of that war's theater being pushed further up into Greece proper, where Macedon became unable to trap assailants on tricky archipelagos rich with natural choke points. In short, there was a lot of activity over the course of this war. Much time passed as skirmishes became the rule of the day, galley battles in the eastern Mediterranean, raiding parties killing each other to a man on the border of Mesopotamia, Scythian incursions laying waste to entire towns before disappearing into the steppe or the desert highland. The war would persist in this low-level state until 207, when many small gains were made into Seleucid territory, and they came knocking not at the gates of Gazric, which had made itself absolutely impregnable to all attack, but rather the city of Ecbatana, the lavish capital of the Seleucid realm. The Seleucids, of course, defended this city, but given they knew of the initial plans against Gazric, the defenses were lighter than usual. Indeed, much lighter than they otherwise would have been. The Seleucids didn't think the Scythians or Armenians could penetrate so deep into their territory, and yet, near the tail end of hundreds of small-scale battles resulting in small-scale gains, they were nearly right outside the city gates. Panicked, Basileus Antiochus II cut short his campaign against Egypt and rushed back home to his capital of Ecbatana. This resulted in the Levantine front collapsing, and Egypt conquering all the way past Lebanon and up to Syria. The city's defenses met the combined Scytho-Armenian army with a stalwart determination, the siege lasting for several weeks before they decided to get ahead of things and got right out onto the field, turning a grinding siege into a full-fledged battle. Infantry on both sides, with more cavalry serving the Scythian army, the Seleucids dug in with their long spears in a tight phalanx formation, bristling with points and edges, all fiercely gleaming in the sun, daring the enemy cavalry to make a charge. Indeed, the Scythians were struggling to make a dent and were losing men by the dozen. Then, what seemed like the final blow arrived. Antiochus II, astride a war elephant, was at the head of 200 more war elephants, shaking the earth as they lumbered forth. It seemed as though the Scythians and their allies would be flattened underfoot the inexorable march of history, so to speak. That was until Rathnacuda unleashed his master plan. Ordering crates from his supply train be brought behind his army, facing the incoming elephants, he broke them open to reveal scores of oiled pigs, squealing and snuffling in their hundreds. As the elephants came yet closer, he then had each of them set alight and freed from their restraints. The burning pigs went running into the elephants' ranks, and they lost all composure amongst the flames and the shrieking. Some bucked their riders, and they all went charging blindly ahead, some of them off into the desert, most of them towards Ecbatana and the army they were meant to support. The Scytho-Armenian army then fled the battle, each army maneuvering in a wide arc around the great city as the elephants trampled their own, devastating the Seleucid army, even killing Antiochus himself in the process, being trampled by elephants as they crashed through the walls of the Seleucid capital and wreaked havoc. The Scythians and Armenians then flooded in and got to pillaging the city and its surrounding settlements, setting fires whose flames would dance in the night for a full week before it would finally be over. The Scythians carried off every statue of Poseidon and Apollo in Ecbatana, and even took a few statues of random local gods as they went, carting off a pantheon with them back to Scythia, carried by the scores of slaves was once worshipped in their splendid temples. The resulting peace savaged the great empire. Scythia took a huge stretch of land in the Caucasus from the Seleucids, obtaining many miles of new coastline in the Caspian Sea, as well as several cities in the Black Sea taken from Macedon. Armenia swelled to its greatest extent, kicking the Seleucids out from Anatolia completely, and gaining the means with which to call themselves an empire. Egypt, alongside its allies Rhodes and Lycia, took much territory from Macedon, essentially depriving them of all the islands they had left, and relegating Macedon to a shell of its former greatness, while Egypt also took the entire Levantine coast, all the way up to Syria, from the Seleucids, cutting them off from the Mediterranean completely. This extreme humbling would cause the new ruler of the Seleucid Empire, the boy king Basileus Antiochus III Seleucid, to turn his gaze eastward, hoping to find less resilient foes on the shores of the Ganges, perhaps fulfilling Alexander's unrealized dream of conquest beyond the edge of the world. But even that would have to wait, as the empire was forced to sit and lick its wounds. This would mark an extended period of relative peace, with Rathnacuda expanding his borders and fathering yet more children, going contentedly into his old age. The rest of the world continued on with a general theme of consolidation during this time as well, as the powers that would come to define Europe took shape. Emporia was, slowly but surely, establishing itself as the new hegemon of the Western Mediterranean, having matured and developed into a mighty trading power, contesting lands in southern Hispania as well. Santonia had continued its centralization and made gains against Remia, leaving Treveria as their only obstacle in the way of eastward expansion. Britannia saw the expansion of Brigantia during this time, a domineering tribe that sought to unite the Isles. In Germania, home to many warring tribes and their dark gods, one tribe seemed blessed by them, as the Kingdom of Suabia erupted onto the scene of world history, the cruel lord of all the Germanics. To the east lay their great rival, Gothonia, home and namesake to the many Goths which reside along the banks of the frigid Oceanus Sarmaticus. To the south, Pieria stood domineering and arrogant, a progeny born from 20 years of conquest with the great Illyrian warlord Sarnos Baizo at its head, sitting upon a throne of skulls as his once obscure mountain tribe claims one entire side of the Adriatic. Finally, of course, Lucania stands as the clear master of Italia, and now jockeys with the much younger powers of the continent for the title of hegemon, and indeed, no claimant yet draws near to such a title. Speaking of claimants and titles, Rathnacuda, now in his 70s, boasts of 102 wives and 143 children, 100 of them sons. As he rides the steppe less and less, and his terrifying body, molded by decades of warfare and conquest into a rough, animalistic physiognomy, becomes hunched and gnarled, it became clear to all that his time as the Sarvan of Scythia was drawing to a close. But yet, he lived, and his impatient army of heirs stood ready to make sure they got their piece of his legacy. To the east, the Indian subcontinent, long the sole domain of the Maurya Empire, now fractures and splits, with rogue claimants leading armies against the throne of India, and the southern Dravidians making their own incursions north against their longtime rivals. In 206, the Seleucids suffered a major revolt, the aristocracy attempting to replace Antiochus III, considering the generation-defining failure of his father. This revolt was eventually put down in 205, with Antiochus retaining his throne and slashing the throats of those disloyal aristocrats who wished to oust him. However, in the Seleucid exclave of Isfahan, which had survived the Fourth Greco-Scythian War, the rebels which controlled the area were safely insulated from the wrath of their royal foe, and would come to conduct much trade with Armenia under the leadership of their famed general, Xenocrates. Eventually, after the death of Xenocrates, they would engage in trade with Scythia as well, and officially bear the name of Isfahan. In June of 200, Armenia conquered Phrygia, putting an end to what was once a powerful claimant to regional dominance in Anatolia. Then, it finally came to pass on the 3rd of March 199 that Sarvan Rathnacuda Agarid, the Scarred Conqueror, the Monster of the North, the Kharvzagat himself, died at the age of 80, surrounded by the statues of the gods in his Hadav Kodah, while laying with one of his wives. This coupling would lead to his final son, born posthumously. This brought his final total to 104 wives and 151 children, 103 of them sons. The land was quiet at his funeral, as despite his madness, there was no doubt at all that he was a great conqueror, and a legendary figure that was possessed by the national spirit of Scythia, propelling him inexorably towards greatness. 10,000 animals were sacrificed that day, including 4 elephants, one for each of the Greco-Scythian wars. The people ate well, and both rich and poor had their fill of sacrificial meat. Rathnacuda was then interred in a great burial mound, full of countless treasures and many of the finest god statues, with Thagamisadus and Goitosiris at his right and left shoulder, and Poseidon and Apollo at his right and left foot, a moat full of mercury surrounding his interior burial chamber. Atop this burial mound, a bronze horse was cast, rearing wild against the summer sun as it rose and fell, casting a great shadow across the steppe during the solstice. Given that this burial mound was essentially in the middle of nowhere, a caste of warrior priests were formed and commanded to guard the grave and its treasures, becoming the Aspadaga, or the Warriors of the Great Steed. The Aspa priests, as they were widely known, were highly trained in the art of war, but also used their unique position as a sedentary and impartial party to court politics to their advantage, eventually holding a position of high honor as the official historians of Scythia and chief priests of their highly syncretic religion. It was said that those worthy of the priesthood had to be able to skewer 2 birds with a single arrow and properly conduct a single sacrifice to 2 gods at the same time. For now, they were simple guardians who slept in the gently blowing grasses, but over time, their station would take the form of a solemn and noble order, an honor above honors for those who proved themselves worthy of it, entering into an unbreakable and eternal vow, sealed with a burn upon the face in honor of Rathnacuda, the great Sarvan. One day, years from now, they would coronate kings, but that day has not yet come. One day, years from now, they would write their records in High Scythian instead of Greek, but that day has not yet come. One day, the name of their brotherhood would be known and would be feared, but that day has not yet come. So, as these simple grave guardians begin their eternal watch, the rest of Scythia stands, uneasy. With over 100 sons, and some even yet to be born, everybody knew it was coming next, as they all had their claims, each and every one of them. The first son to assume the pretension of rulership would be Rathnacuda's firstborn, Uday-Agarid, but there was a problem. Uday was 63. He was an old man for all intents and purposes, and even as he strode towards the royal complex at Tafros, bare-chested and anointed with horseblood, his body was one of a royal son, chubby and hunched, and certainly not warlike. He made it 3 days as Sarvan before a sword was plunged through the side of his neck by a much younger brother, Iparsalke, who was only 14, and who himself was totally unable to secure the right to rule. Scythia fractured into 100 pieces, and the Dyrg Vaarza officially began. Meaning the long age, it was a time where Scythia slipped into chaos, divvied up by warlords, Rathnacuda's army of sons. The other clans at this point were totally outnumbered by the teeming progeny of the Agarid clan, and were forced to throw their support behind one son or another in order to survive. For the first 20 years, there was almost unceasing bloodshed, and those not blessed by history or otherwise lucky enough to survive were cruelly dispatched, buried ignobly, if at all. By 179, Scythia was now divided between several major claimants. The largest and most commanding of them was Rathnacuda's youngest son, conceived at the moment of his death beneath the watchful gaze of the gods, Salamander Agarid. Young and determined, he commanded all the land between the Tanais and Hra rivers in the east, believed by himself and all his followers as being a god-born son of prophecy, a demigod destined to lead Scythia to glory. Further south, along the shores of the Caspian Sea, Risvadam Agarid made his claim. Risvadam was a calm, collected realist, rooted in strategy and an adept knowledge of how to properly cultivate power. For all intents and purposes, he was nothing like his father. His mission was to drag Scythia kicking and screaming out of what he saw as savagery. Meanwhile, to the west, Crimea wasn't held by an Agarid at all, but rather by one of the great clans, the Datanpur, headed by Yasenaka Datanpur. The other clans had chosen their masters and would indeed be simply dissolved into the Agarid clan with time, but the Datanpur, once the most loyal and dedicated of all the great clans, saw the overbearing tyranny of the Agarid claimants as an affront to the Scythian way of life, a threat that must be dealt with, a monster that must be stopped. To the west, the claimant which controlled all land beyond the Brosthenes was Menaidas Agarid. The son of a Greek mother, he was a dedicated Hellenizer, constructing temples to the gods, conducting sacrifices himself, and even establishing working relationships with Greek powers like Thrace, Ionia, and Rhodes. This Hellenic xenophilia would alienate him from nearly all proud Scythians, but his military genius was indisputable, and his campaign of Greek settlement in his lands brought him natural allies, even if they were foreigners. These factors ensured that, at least for the time being, Menaidas was not going anywhere. The Great Central Steppe was still divided between many claimants, and was a major battleground throughout the Dyrg Vaarza, though the largest of these scattered claimants was Upal Agarid, who was very much like his father. He loved war, he reveled in it, and thirsted for blood and gore. He prayed to the spirit of his father every day, thanking him for the age of unending bloodshed that he was born into. So, these were the major parties vying for power during the Dyrg Vaarza, whose last names would eventually change with time as they had less and less in common with each other, moving the Agarid name to their middle name. The only Agarid to keep his last name was Salamander. As such, the major claimants were the Agarids, the Risvadites, the Datanpur, the Menadites, and the Upali. None of these men, for all their fire and rage, would come to see themselves with the wreath of victory upon their head. Indeed, neither were their children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. These factions would war against each other for centuries, with a little land changing hands here or there, as the rest of the world went on, in a sense, without them. This was an age of quiet growth and consolidation nearly all around the world, as tribes became kingdoms and kingdoms became empires. In 110 BC, Armenia's homeland territory in the Caucasus was attacked by a band of Greeks led by a strategic genius known as Kragos, who escaped the death penalty in Macedon for sleeping with his brother's daughter, his brother being the Basileus himself, Lycurgos Hilioklid. Kragos the Sinner, as he came to be known, established the kingdom of Maeotia in what was once the original homeland of mighty Armenia. The two would be in near constant conflict until 97 BC, when the Agarid, Upali, and Rizvidite factions of Scythia all declared separate wars of conquest against Maeotia, which, unable to withstand the pressure of a two-front war, fell by 94 BC. Korogos the Sinner becoming a famed pirate operating in the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean, leading a pirate fleet called the Maeotian Marauders, flying a purple banner in reference to his royal blood. Armenia requested the land which Scythia conquered from Maeotia be returned to Armenia, but none of the factions agreed, preferring to keep the land for themselves, severing their relationship with what was once Scythia's most loyal ally, and most powerful friend. In 51 BC, the Seleucids came again, but they were turned back by the combined might of the factions, and it did not blossom into a wider conflict. And this is how Scythia rides out the final days of antiquity. Before the wars of religion, before the continental politics of the royal courts, there is only the war on the steppe that rages for generations, as the rest of the world fills in, expands, and shapes the future the divided Scythia will one day wake to find itself in.